Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ESS Weekly Seminar. I'm super excited today to introduce Mody, who is our seminar speaker for this week. Mody has a PhD in engineering from the Dublin Institute of Technology in Ireland. He has two master's degrees, one in manufacturing and mechanical and manufacturing engineering, and a second master's degree in energy and power. Mody joined our lab in 2019 as part of a bigger project that looks at the impact of commodity trade on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And so I'll give it all to Mody. He's going to be talking today about some of the work that he has been leading in our lab. And I'm looking forward to, I'll pass it over to you, Mody.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis, for the introduction. Yeah. Thanks to everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to present today to the department. And the title of my presentation is Sustainable Commodity Trade, the Case of Palm Oil in Africa. So before I proceed with the presentation, I want us to watch a short documentary that was produced in Cameroon, and it's titled A Smallholder's Voice. So in this documentary, we're going to see how smallholders in Cameroon, who produce nearly all of the cocoa in the country, as well as 40% of oil palms, what they are going through during the production process. So it's a 5-minute video, a documentary. I just want us to take some time and watch.
Le cacao, c'est quelque chose qui est trop important. On le travaille parce que pour mieux garder la famille, pour mieux sauvegarder encore la famille de dehors.
Cameroon has the ambition to increase its cocoa production, which is on average 300,000 tons per year to 600,000 tons by 2030.
The demand for oil palm has grown, and so many governments, particularly in Africa, including Cameroon, are seeing the oil palm production as a sector where they can grow the GDP of the country, but also to alleviate poverty.
And given this very ambitious project, we can see that there's going to be a lot of pressure that is going to be put on existing forests.
Farmers are trapped in a cycle where they have to borrow money in anticipation for some revenue that's based on a price that's not set by them. That price for cocoa is set by the international market. And then you have a lot of people within the supply chain. You have the chocolate producers, and then you have the large merchants or trading companies that buy from different countries and then supply to the industries. And then down the supply chain, you also have all the middlemen, the cooperatives that interact directly with the farmers. And at the end of the day, less than 10% of the revenue of that trade actually goes back down to the farmer. Sometimes it's like 5% or 6%.
Farmers are facing the realities. They have to go to them, they have to explain to them, they have to understand the basis of those rules. And there should not be rules that are drafted at the international level, and signed at the international level without their own participation and also without explaining it to them.
Presque pas. Et ici, la durabilité vient avec des contraintes supplémentaires qui vont augmenter les coûts. Et si le prix reste le même, ça ne peut pas aller. Ça ne peut pas aller.
electrification alone is not the silver bullet that will provide solutions to the sustainability issues within cocoa and the palm oil sectors. But then it's just one of the mechanisms that can be used to make these sectors more sustainable. It has to be part of a hybrid strategy that involves government policies, government regulations, and also a strategy that involves smallholders who are at the center of the production of these commodities, so that they will get their voices heard, get all the issues that they are facing during the production process, because they are the ones contributing towards deforestation. They are the ones facing all the socioeconomic issues. So if they are put at the center and get them involved in the decision-making process, I think it will be a more lasting way to get trade within the sectors more sustainable.
Okay, so thanks for watching the short documentary. We have the longer version, which is available on YouTube. So you'd find a link in the presentation that will be shared. Okay. Okay, so I'll proceed with the presentation. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the background. I'll present the background on palm oil. I'm going to talk about the socioeconomic impacts of palm oil trade. And then I'll proceed to look at, or to present some of the nuances that are in obtaining sustainability in the palm oil sector. And there I'll talk about management practices, financial viability of investing in palm oil. And then I'll also present some of the research on the cost based on the lost ecosystem services and the benefits that people derive from oil palm production. And then I'll present some of the sustainability instruments that are used within the sector, and then also present the way forward. So in terms of the background, there are several agreements, like the Paris Agreement that was signed by about 196 countries with the aim to limit global temperature rise to within 1 degree centigrade right up to 2050. And that's aimed at limiting the impacts of climate change. And for the Paris Agreement to be achieved, we need to limit greenhouse gas emissions as well as use nature-based solutions. So as you see from the chart on the right, the energy sector is the highest greenhouse gas emitting sector, followed by the agricultural sector. So our work is concentrated on the agricultural sector because it's the second largest emitting greenhouse gas emission sector. So just to give you some background about oil palms, They actually grown within the equator, about 10 degrees north as well as 10 degrees south of the equator. And it's a tropical plant that requires warm and humid temperatures. And it also needs sufficient moisture in the soil, so it needs a lot of rainfall. So the graph on the top right shows us the evolution of the area cultivated for oil palms. We see that oil palms originated from Africa, and in the 60s, it was taken over to Latin America and Southeast Asia. And since then, Southeast Asia, after about around 1970s, took over as the leading producers of palm oil. So there we see how the area cultivated has increased over time. In the chart on the bottom, we see the major producers. So Indonesia and Malaysia are the main producers, with Indonesia dominating. And these two countries produce about 85% of all palm oil in the world. So the chart on the left shows us that palm oil, in terms of vegetable oil production, has the largest proportion. It accounts for about 38% of all or 35% of all vegetable oil produced, ahead of soy. And this crop is actually the most efficient oil crop in terms of land use, using about 4.5 to 8 times less land than other vegetable crops. And that is so because it has the highest yield per hectare than all other oil crops. So it's interesting to note that if you go to the supermarket, more than 50% of the products that you buy do contain palm oil. So there are derivatives of palm oil, and you'll find it in our food, in animal feed, as well as in different chemical products. Palm oil is also used to generate as an energy crop. So you'll find it in biofuels. They use it to generate electricity as well as heat. It also has a positive effect in that it contributes to the GDP of the countries where it's grown, and it also contributes to economic growth. Despite the benefits or the positive aspects that we get from palm oil, it also comes with a lot of negative impacts on the environment and on people. So the pictures you see on the left show us the impacts of deforestation. Being mainly a monoculture, what happens is that all the forest has to be cut down for you to be able to plant oil palms. The pictures we have on the at the middle show us some of the negative impacts on people in terms of land grabbing. So usually when companies get into communities, they would grab the land that the people own. And the picture at the top in the middle shows us a grave that's embedded in within a plantation. So people within communities usually go through all those problems. Then mainly in Southeast Asia, it contributes to the destruction of peatlands. So the pictures we have on the left show us how peatlands are drained, and then after draining them, they burn and then replace them with palm oil. So because of these negative impacts, there have been a lot of calls for sustainability within the sector. And it's very common to go to find newspaper articles that talk about the impacts of deforestation and different actions that have been taken by countries like the US, banning, blocking palm oil imports from Malaysia, where Sim Dabi had been accused of forced labor allegations. And then in Cameroon, the Lacour Farms was awarded 70,000 hectares of land to develop oil palms. And they did not take into consideration the communities that had been living in those lands. So a lot of NGOs as well as other agencies actually came in, and they've been putting a lot of pressure on companies that are growing palm. So there have been several responses towards sustainability. And recently during COP26, 100 world leaders signed on to no deforestation commitments. And you've also had some companies that are coming on board with to help make the sector sustainable. In our research, we decided to look, a lot of work has been done on the environmental side, looking at the negative impacts of palm oil trade on the environment. But very little work has been done looking at the impacts, the socioeconomic impacts. So we went ahead to look at the negative impacts on ecosystem services. And there we carried out a global review that was titled and published it in the Journal of Cleaner Production. The title of the paper is Towards Sustainable Palm Oil Production, the Negative and Positive Impacts on Ecosystem Services and Humans. And in this paper, we aim to understand the direct or socioeconomic impacts of palm oil trade. And indices that we use were income, infrastructure, and some others. And then we also aim to understand the indirect benefits through ecosystem services like food provisioning and climate regulation. We also went ahead to understand how these impacts were distributed among both smallholders as well as agro-industrial plantations. In the review, we looked at two different sources of literature. We looked at peer-reviewed literature as well as gray literature. In gray literature, we looked at the Environmental Justice Atlas that has documented more than 3,000 cases of negative impacts on people within different countries. And in this study, the results we had was not surprising that most of the studies in scientific literature were published in Indonesia and Malaysia, which are the countries that account for the highest production. And for gray literature, most of the impacts reported were in Indonesia, as well as Peru and Malaysia. So in the review, we found out a lot of negative impacts. And in scientific literature, the major impacts were conflicts, negative impacts on housing condition, as well as land grabbing. And from the gray literature, we found overwhelming impacts or responses of impacts on livelihoods, as well as land grabbing and health impacts on people. Then we also looked at the indirect negative impacts on ecosystem services. And from scientific literature, we found negative impacts on food production, carbon sequestration, as well as water treatment. While in gray literature, we found overwhelming negative impacts on erosion prevention, carbon sequestration, as well as habitat protection. So despite the overwhelming negative impacts, there were also a few positive impacts. On the direct impacts, we found the highest reported was on income, the income that the farmers get from oil palm, as well as a provision of employment. And then the large agro-industrial companies usually provide hospitals for health services for their workers as well as neighboring communities. For the indirect positive impacts that were reported, we had aesthetic appreciation, where you had just 4%, as well as local climate and air quality, where about 4% was also reported. So having looked at the socioeconomic impacts of palm oil trade, we then said we should look at what are the nuisances in obtaining sustainability within the palm oil sector in Africa. So there we looked at the different management practices. We tried to evaluate the financial viability of smallholders investing in oil palms. Then we also looked at the cost in terms of lost ecosystem services when forests are converted into oil palm plantations. And then we also looked at the benefits that oil palm people get derived from oil palm production. So looking at the countries, the impact of agriculture on deforestation in Africa, we went back and looked at the countries where oil palm are cultivated. And now in these countries, you have about 900 million hectares of land that is occupied by these countries. But then, as we see on the graph, it shows us that the forest area in those countries has been decreasing since 1990. And during that period, these countries lost about 64 million hectares of land, of forest. And at the same time, the agricultural land increased by about 45 million hectares. So here you see that as the forest area decreases, the area used for agricultural land also increased. And then we also looked at the contribution of palm oil in terms of the area cultivated. And there we see that the area increased by 1.4 million hectares between 1990 and 2017. That was an increase of about 43%. Looking at emissions in Africa, we carried out a study that was published in 2021, looking at the emissions from fossil fuels between 1990 and 2014, and found out that emissions had been on a continuous increase, especially in South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, and Algeria. But then we also found in our study that Africa is in a path. When you look at the graph on the left, it shows us the evolution of GDP per capita in different countries. And there we also see that Africa has been on a path of development, and that has also contributed to an increase in CO2 emissions. And then from our research, we also found that commodity trade brings about development. So as the more people trade, it increases the GDP of the countries. And at the same time, people become more affluent, and then it also helps to increase greenhouse gas emissions. So while all of this is happening, African countries have discovered that they can make more money and get their people more affluent when they invest in oil palm. So given the increase in oil palm consumption in the world, Africa intends to play a greater role. And you've had a ban on deforestation within the sector in countries in Southeast Asia. So Africa has now been kind of the new frontier, and the African governments are taking advantage of this. So countries like Cameroon have signed on to double their production from their baseline of 2010, from 230,000 metric tons by 2035. Gabon has also signed up to increase its production from 13,000 tons in 2011 to about 280,000 tons by 2025. Ghana is also planning to expand its oil palm and as well as sugarcane production, partly due to the demand for fuel, biofuels. Liberia also has spent about $500 million to increase the cultivated area by 220,000 hectares. So we're seeing that all of these policies would have an impact on deforestation. So to understand some of those nuances, we decided to organize a workshop in Cameroon where with smallholder farmers. We had about 60 farmers in attendance. And then we also carried out a survey on 125 oil palm farmers, as well as 125 non-oil palm farmers. So here we wanted to understand the different management practices that are in place. So there are two different categories of people who produce. You have the agro-industrial companies as well as the smallholder farmers. And smallholder farmers, from some of the recent research, showed that they are increasingly contributing more to deforestation than the large agro-industrial companies. So we decided to focus our attention to the smallholders. And these are farmers who produce palm oil, who grow oil palms, and then they do that alongside some other crops, subsistence crops, so they get some revenue out of it and provide for their food needs. But then these are a group of farmers where the family, most of the income of the family income comes from oil palms, and then the family also provides most of the labor. And they usually occupy, cultivate oil palms on land that's below 50 hectares. So we also try to investigate how the area cultivated by oil palm is distributed amongst these smallholders, and found out that more than 50% of the smallholders cultivate on less than 2 hectares. And then about 30% cultivate land that's between 2 and 5 hectares. Then in terms of land conversion, about 30% of these smallholders convert secondary forests into oil palm plantations. And then some of them convert about 25% of them do convert wild palms into oil palm plantation. And just around 20% of them do convert primary forest into oil palm plantations. So from here we see that cultivation of oil palms actually contributes a lot to deforestation. Then we went ahead to look at the milling practices. So once they've produced the fresh fruit bunches, they have to mill it or mill them to produce palm oil. And here we found out that about over 70% of the processing is done using artisanal mills, like what you find at the top, and the pictures at the top. And then they also use very rudimentary methods to produce. So, and during the process, they use a lot of wood, and then they generate a lot of smoke that pollutes the environment. And also most of the palm oil meal effluent, which is the waste, liquid waste that comes out, is just dumped into the environment, thereby contributing to deforestation. And here, most of the non-artisanal mills can either be large agro-industrial mills, or you find medium-sized mills like the picture that we find at the bottom right. So that mill was sponsored by UNIDO, where they discovered that the milling efficiencies were very low. So they decided to institute some of those mills. But as we would find later, that although those large mills are very efficient compared to the artisanal mills, most of the smallholders do not want to mill their fresh fruit bunches in those mills, because most often they suffer from late payment. So they would supply the fresh fruit bunches, but then it takes sometimes a month or 2 months for them to be paid. And then you also have corrupt practices where the weight of the fresh fruit bunches supplied sometimes are kind of manipulated, and that results in the companies losing a lot of money. We found out that most of the efficiencies of converting the fresh fruit bunches into crude palm oil were very low. So about 41% reported that the efficiencies were less than 15%, and then 38% reported that the efficiencies are between 15 and 20%. So then we went ahead to find out, to investigate the profitability or financial viability of smallholders investing in oil palms. And there we produced a paper that we published in PLOS ONE, and the title is Does Investment in Oil Palm Trade Alleviate Smallholders from Poverty in Africa? And here we wanted to investigate the profitability of smallholders investing in oil palms. And we looked at 3 different scenarios which are prevalent within smallholders. So when they produce their fresh fruit bunches, they can either sell them to intermediaries who would either mill or sell to larger mills. Or if they are closer to large agro-industrial mills, they can sell the fresh fruit bunches directly to the mills. But then they also have the possibility of using the artisanal mills to mill, even though they are inefficient, to produce crude palm oil. So we carried out the analysis. It was a life cycle analysis over 28 years, which is the life cycle of palm oil. And then we used a base interest rate of 8% and then a land cost of 0, considering that the farmers do own land. So under these 3 scenarios, we found out that it was more profitable for the smallholders to mill the fresh fruit bunches and produce crude palm oil. So they make more money when they do that, rather than sell fresh fruit bunches to intermediaries. And then it was also interesting to note that under certain conditions, the smallholders do not actually make any profit. But then we found out that it's really difficult for them to evaluate the profitability, because you kind of invest today and then you have your returns. They start coming in year 3 or year 4, and that happens right up to the 25th year. So under those conditions, it's really difficult for smallholders to be able to evaluate the financial profitability. And we found out that some of them get into it not because it's a business, but probably because they inherited the farms from their parents. So they just continue doing it without knowing whether it's profitable for them. We also went ahead to do some sensitivity analysis to investigate the effects of interest rates, because most of these farmers do not have all the money upfront to invest in the farms, so they have to borrow money. And there are some government programs existing that actually provide loans to farmers. But then what we found from our study is that depending on the rate at which you borrow money, there is a certain rate beyond which you lose. The investment is not financially viable. And we think information like this can be very helpful to governments as well as other bodies that are trying to make that sector sustainable from an economic standpoint. We also found out that the cost of land is also a very important parameter. So we looked at the case where the farmers have customary ownership of land. So in that case, they don't have to buy land. But then you also have people who invest in oil palms and they don't own land, so they have to buy land. So depending on the cost of land, beyond a certain level, you start losing. So we believe that it's important for farmers to be able to, or potential investors to be able to look into the financial viability before getting into investing into palm oil. So we also went ahead to look at the cost in terms of lost ecosystem services. So when you convert forests into oil palms, you lose some ecosystem services. And then farmers do derive benefits from the revenue that they derive from the crude palm oil they produce. So on the left, we see the different provisioning services that people get from oil palms. So the blue chart shows us the no, and then the orange shows us the services that they get. So here we see that in terms of provisioning services, very few of those services are actually obtained from oil palm plantations. And then on the right, we see the provisioning services that people get from forests. So they would get firewood or fuel wood from the forest. They get materials that they use in weaving different objects. They also get timber that they use in building their houses. They get medicinal plants as well as non-timber forest products. We also went ahead to look at, to compare the regulating services that are provided by forests against those provided by oil palms. And here we're able to compare based on the responses that we got from the farmers, that they get better water quality in the forest. The forests are usually cooler than oil palm plantations. And then they also get better air quality from the forest, as well as better soil fertility than in oil palm plantations. Then we also looked at the cultural services that are obtained in oil palm plantations. And we realized that there are very few. So you would find, for example, very few people going in for tourism purposes, as well as recreation. We also went ahead to look at the financial benefits that farmers derive from oil palm plantations and compared them to the benefits that they get from the forest. So from the forest, they mainly get revenue from the provisioning services that the forest provides to them. So they evaluate the non-timber forest products that they get and sell. So what revenue that they get. And based on what we found was that they receive some considerable amount of money from the forest compared to oil palm plantations. Although for larger sizes of oil palm plantations, they derive more revenue. So this for us is useful in terms of looking at possible payments for ecosystem services. So here we see that if you want to come up with incentives for the farmers to keep the forest standing, then you have to provide, if you provide some additional revenue on top of the revenue that they derive from the forest, it can serve as an incentive for them rather than going into planting oil palms. They can add that revenue to what they are getting from the forest to encourage them to keep the forest standing. So we also looked at different sustainability instruments within the sector. So you can either do that through regulations or using voluntary standards. So there are two existing methods. And an example of regulation is the current EU due diligence regulation, aiming to reduce deforestation within the supply chain. So here we found out that the EU actually consumes about 16% of all agricultural commodities. And these commodities do contribute to deforestation. And that then makes the EU the second largest driver of deforestation. Now, the EU regulation is a mandate, actually spells out mandatory due diligence for companies that are importing products like palm oil, beef, timber, as well as their derived products into the EU. And they would want them to ensure that these products are not linked to deforestation. Within the palm oil sector, we've also had voluntary standards, the main one being RSPO, which is the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. It was launched in 2004 as a voluntary standard. And most of these standards, you also have the Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil as well as the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil voluntary standards. And most of them, they talk about, they do not want people to replace primary forest with oil palm, and then you don't also have to replace high conservation value forest or areas with palm oil, and they are not allowed to plant on steep slopes because it contributes a lot to soil erosion, and then they are not allowed to use forced or child labor. So these voluntary standards have actually had some inroads, especially in Malaysia and Indonesia, where we've had about 100 groups of farmers who've been certified. And these groups sometimes are in the thousands. So in Sierra Leone, where we have a few certified, there is a group that has about 5,000 farmers. So this has led to about 20% of all palm oil produced in the world being certified. And then we have about 4 million hectares of certified land. And in Africa, unfortunately, we just have less than 1% of smallholders who are certified. So there is potential for the smallholders to be certified. And it's important to note that the certification process teaches them how to use good agricultural practices, and there are other benefits that help them to improve the quality of their production. So despite the benefits of certification, the farmers do face challenges. The cost of certification is very high. It's above $100,000. So you need large groups of farmers to be able to overcome that cost. The premiums are also low. So they offer premiums because of the quality of the palm oil produced, but these premiums are low. So they end up resulting in low earnings. And then the farmers have difficulties in owning land. And that's one of the requirements of certification. And because they also have to keep a lot of records, the high level of illiteracy among the farmers does not facilitate the task for them. So there are some benefits that independent smallholders can get. So they can get financing as well as technical support in terms of training and capacity building on good agricultural practices. That results in improved farm maintenance as well as their productivity. And then it also creates access to international markets where they can sell at higher prices. We went ahead then to find out from the farmers what their perceptions about getting certified was. So an overwhelming majority, about 78% of them, said they were willing to be certified based on the benefits that they would derive, while 22% said no. And then most of them also said they would subscribe to not expanding their farms into forest land. And some of them, or the majority, also accepted to no child labor. But those who said they wouldn't subscribe to that, whether they have their children and they do not see why they should not make use of them. And then 88% said they would subscribe to discussing their planned expansions of their farms with communities. So looking at, I just have a few conclusions and a way forward. So around 90% of global deforestation can be attributed to the expansion of agricultural land. Tropical deforestation contributes to about 20% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. And when you convert forests into oil palms, we actually lose a lot of vital ecosystem services that are provided by forests. So looking at the way forward, we think we have to develop ways of improving on-farm as well as milling efficiencies, especially for smallholders. So to help them adopt good agricultural practices as well as better milling systems. Regulations have to be put in place as well as also adopt voluntary certification standards that will help them improve on their yields as well as reduce the impacts on deforestation. And we've been working on developing a digital extension tool. We believe that based on the gaps we've seen, that digital extension tools are necessary that can help farmers who want to invest in oil palms to be able to assess the financial viability of the investment before they get into it. These tools can also help in terms of traceability so that we can have GPS points of all the farms, and then you can trace where the farms are located as well as where the oil palm comes from. And these tools can also help in terms of information sharing on good agricultural practices, as well as other useful information on prices and so on. And finally, they can also be used to train and build capacity for smallholder farmers. Now, this work is part of work that's been funded by the Global Challenge Fund, research fund in the UK that Venice mentioned at the beginning. And the focal countries are Brazil, and then in Africa we have Cameroon, Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Tanzania, and then you also have Indonesia and China. And there are over 50 partners in different institutions around the US, Latin America, Asia, and Europe, as well as Africa. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Mody. We'll take questions now. Do you have any questions?
Yes.
What's the typical lifetime of a palm oil plantation from when you first plant it? How long is it productive? Is it a few years or forever, or?
It's about 25 years
And then
when it starts producing.
New land or replant or?
Yeah, so most often you'd have to cut down the trees and then replant if you still want to do oil palms. Yeah. So it takes about 3 years once you plant. It takes about 3 years before it starts producing, and then production kind of increases and then peaks for a couple of years and then starts decreasing.
Mm-hmm. So Mody, I just wanted to, so I noticed that you didn't talk about AFTA, the African Trade Union initiative that they're starting now. So I was thinking now, because oil palm is mostly consumed in Africa, so I can see people not wanting to sell in Europe in any case. So what is the impact of the EU due diligence? Do you think AFTA can come with a new rule that encourages Africans to sell oil to Africans?
Yeah, thanks, Venice. I think that's a great question. So most of the palm oil produced in the world is in Malaysia and Indonesia, and they export a lot of it. But when you come down to Africa, it's interesting to note that most of the palm oil produced is either consumed in the local markets or the regional markets. So in terms of some of the regulations, if they are not local, but external, like the EU due diligence, it might be quite tricky to be able to implement that within African countries, because most of the palm oil produced is consumed either in the local market or within the regional market. And even with the proposed increases in production, I think with the African free trade agreement coming up into place, it will open up the African market to most of the production in Africa. So the challenge now is that it might be difficult to control deforestation within these countries, even though most of the deforestation is happening now increasingly in Africa. So I think it's a big challenge. And we're hoping that studies like the ones we are carrying out will be able to inform policy making within that sector. Yes.
So I noticed that you were saying that palm oil or the palm tree was originally from Africa and that there are wild plantations of this. So are people looking at trying to harvest more palm oil from the more natural plantations of it rather than having to clear land? Is that a more sustainable way, or is it just there's no efficiency of scale to doing it that way?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So in the early years in Africa, especially the smallholders, they were not looking at it from an industrial perspective or standpoint. They were looking at palm oil as a crop that they produce and consume locally. But with time, when they started realizing that they could make money out of it, and then there were government programs encouraging them to get into oil palm farming, they started expanding. And so initially they were using the local breeds of palm oil, but then the government came up with different programs, like in Cameroon, giving out improved seedlings, like those that they have in Malaysia and Indonesia. So we are increasingly seeing people using more of the improved seedlings, producing more in terms of fresh fruit bunches, but then the efficiencies are still very low when it comes to converting the fresh fruit bunches to crude palm oil. Any other question? Yes.
What's going on the demand side for palm oil internationally? I mean, is it growing fast, or is it steady, or is it, what's the future like for palm oil demand?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So for global demand of palm oil, it's increasing. It's been increasing over the years, and we are already over 65 million tons a year. And it's increasing because it's the cheapest vegetable oil that you find in the market, but then it's also very efficient in terms of land use. And when you also, it's very versatile. So when you go to the supermarkets, you find out that it's increasingly being used in most of the products that we buy. More than 50% you would find of palm oil in it. So demand, with world population increasing, the demand for palm oil has just been increasing. Yes.
You opened with a trade development and environment hub that looked like a national organization. Is the country promoting agribusiness size farms to dramatically increase revenue for the country, in addition to supporting the smallholder farms?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So most of these countries they've been supporting smallholders, but they also encourage large agro-industrial companies to come in. So a good example is the case in Cameroon, where the government, there was a US-based company that went to Cameroon, and the government gave them 70,000 hectares of land within 4 protected areas. So you had a lot of environmentalists who intervened, and that area was reduced to about 23,000 hectares. So there is a push towards that. And then you also have companies that are within the cosmetic industry, as well as refineries that produce vegetable oil. that are also moving towards opening up their own plantations to meet up with the demand for crude palm oil. Yes, I think you're about to answer.
I want to know if there's any evidence yet that those certifications in Malaysia and Indonesia have slowed down deforestation. Could it just be that other farmers who are not certified will deforest and on the black market sell the palm oil somehow? Like, I could see lots of ways where it may not work, and I'm curious if there's evidence that it's working.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So if you look at Malaysia and Indonesia, there are smallholders who account for like 50% of the production. But unlike the situation in Africa, they do not mill in artisanal mills. So they produce fresh fruit bunches and sell to the large agro-industrial companies. And their certification has actually had a positive impact in terms of kind of stopping deforestation. So we've had a combination of certification and regulations that have helped to stop deforestation. But then that has pushed a lot of these large multinational companies to look towards Latin America and Africa. And the situation in Africa is different now because you have very few certification standards being applied, and then the countries do not even have national palm oil strategies. So regulations are not in place. And so there is the risk that under business as usual, deforestation will just increase in those countries. Yes.
It's actually reducing in Indonesia. I mean, the IUCN Task Force for Oils, and we will share the website that tracks deforestation in Indonesia, and it's going down. Well, whether it's attributed to RSPO and the Indonesian regulatory standards, I have no idea. So Jim,
so I noticed in one of your surveys that a lot of the farmers identified that it was hotter in the palm oil areas. And I'm curious, I think that the palm oil is like a more ancient plant than some of the more evergreen or the conifer, not the conifer, the broadleaf trees in the rainforest. So I'm curious from your own experience, is it hotter like under, are they not evaporating as much water out, the palm oil plantations? What is the effect on the local environment from it? Or is it not detectable? Just you can't really tell.
Yeah, I don't think I really got the question.
Was there a slide that said that the farmers thought it was hotter under the palm oil? Maybe I missed that. Maybe I got it wrong.
What's the effect? Are you asking about the effect on the local environment?
Yeah, does the palm oil make it hotter? Sort of in the local environment near the villages.
Yeah, so we're looking at the microclimate inside the palm oil plantation compared to inside the forest. So in the forest, you have more trees and the climate is it's cooler than in oil palm plantations because you have a prescribed distance between the oil palms. So when they start growing up, they get to a point where they have this canopy but it's not usually the impact of the canopy on the microclimate is not as much as that of forest. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Mody.